So I think I've been struggling with trying to figure out what topic to cover here today, but I had to get a little bit better view of the audience and talk to people here before I could decide. So I think what I'd like to do is to say something about the history of how we got here, and especially how we got to the 1990s, how we made it through the 1990s, the crypto wars. It used to be illegal to export strong cryptography from the US, and also from a lot of the Western allies, Britain and France. France didn't have export controls, but they had domestic controls, and England had a little bit of both. But the United States had only export controls, but no domestic controls, although they tried to impose domestic controls with the Clipper chip. Have you guys heard of the Clipper chip? Yeah? And some of the people with gray hair have heard of the Clipper chip, right? But that was a chip that the FBI was promoting that they would put in every phone to make secure phone calls. And it had, each chip had a unique key for encrypting the phone calls that the FBI had a copy of that key in a vast government database for wiretap purposes. And oddly enough, much to the surprise of the FBI, the free market did not choose to purchase products with the Clipper chip in it. Can't imagine why. And then the FBI said that if people don't buy products with the Clipper chip in it, then the FBI would have no choice but to seek legislative relief. That means passing laws compelling people to use the Clipper chip. So in the 1990s, it was kind of a hostile environment for strong cryptography. And the reason why the government had this attitude was because, going back to World War II, the outcome of the war was strongly influenced by the ability for the Allies to break the encryption algorithms of their enemies. Bletchley Park had the thousands of people working there, and they broke the Enigma machine. They broke the Enigma cipher. Alan Turing and his team broke that. And they also were able to break the Japanese codes. The Battle of Midway was decisively decided by the fact that the Americans could read the Japanese traffic. And that shortened the war by probably a couple of years. And breaking Enigma and breaking other German ciphers shortened the war by a couple of years, saving millions of lives. So you can see why they developed this attitude that it was important after World War II. It was important for the US and Britain and I guess, I don't know what the French position was because they didn't have export controls, but they had domestic controls. But it was important for the US and the UK that they be able to continue breaking the encryption algorithms of their enemies in case there was another war. And so they had export controls. So fast forward several decades to the internet age, and now, in order to build the information society that we have come to rely on, the rest of society needed to have access to strong cryptography. And it wasn't easy for the government to let go of their old attitudes. And we had to fight them for it during the whole decade of the 1990s. Part of that battle was PGP. When I published PGP in 1991, the government took the position that that was a violation of the Arms Export Control Act. And so they thought that, that publishing something on the internet was the same as exporting it, which is true. It is the same as exporting it. It goes everywhere, like dandelion seeds blowing in the wind. And so they launched a criminal investigation. I was the target of this criminal investigation for 3 years. And so, from my point of view, the crypto wars of the 1990s was largely about me keeping out of prison. And so, but after the 3 years was, passed and the government finally dropped their case against me without indicting me, we still had several more years to go. We had to fight for changing the laws until the end of the 1990s. It was in 2000 when the US government, finally dropped the export controls on strong cryptography. And the French had already dropped their domestic controls a couple years earlier. And when the US government dropped their export controls, the British did too. And they dropped their domestic controls as well. And so we had to fight for the whole decade. And during that decade, we had broad participation from the whole of society. We had, in this debate, we had the FBI, which never changed their mind. They continued to doggedly insist that we hang on to the export controls. The NSA had kind of dropped out of the debate because they decided that they were going to solve the problem in a different way. Rather than have export controls, they would concentrate on their ability to insert malware in the endpoints. And that became much more apparent when Snowden revealed a lot of things about how the NSA were doing that. But we had broad participation from academia, from journalists, from Congress, from the courts, from human rights activists, from tech companies. Just about everybody got involved. And we had a near consensus that it was time to let go of the export controls. And we kept on putting pressure on the White House, the Clinton White House, to do this. And an election year, 2000 was an election year, and the Democrats felt they had to win California, and they weren't going to win, or it would be harder to win California if they insisted on keeping the export controls. They needed the support of Silicon Valley, and almost the entire roster of companies in Silicon Valley wanted the export controls to be gone. So there was also litigation going on to force the hand, from getting the judiciary to have a say in it. And Congress was considering legislation to drop the export controls. So the executive branch in the US decided that they had to do it because the other two branches of government were putting pressure on them and would do it for them if they didn't do it themselves. So they did. In 2000, they dropped the export controls on strong cryptography. Now, since that time, as soon as they dropped the export controls, we saw the proliferation of strong cryptography in all kinds of products. And every web browser had SSL, which we know today as TLS. They started upping the key length and making it stronger. Mail clients also used TLS to connect to mail servers. PGP was exported all over the world. VPNs emerged later, SSH. All kinds of protocols emerged that used strong cryptography. And it was perfectly legal, and it proliferated all over the world. But now, we find that 20 years later, after we thought we won this struggle, some of the important Western democracies are coming back with kind of pushback against end-to-end encryption. In particular, the Five Eyes, plus I think India and Japan, were pushing for re-regulating end-to-end encryption. They didn't care so much about hopwise encryption. That's like going through TLS from a client to a server. They didn't care about that because law enforcement could always go to the server, go to the bank, go to Amazon, go to whatever e-commerce site you're talking to, and demand that they turn over whatever records they have of your conversations with them. But end-to-end encryption, they insisted that we reimpose controls on end-to-end encryption. And that's been going on for the last few years. And so I think that this is a terrible mistake, and it's 20 years too late. You know, we've become thoroughly entrenched. There's strong encryption everywhere with end-to-end encryption in so many products. PGP was end-to-end encryption. The Signal protocol is end-to-end encryption. WhatsApp uses the Signal protocol, so that's another billion or so users, 2 billion users. And so, you know, there's no way to do it, and there shouldn't be a way to do it. You know, they're complaining so much about this that, you know, that they're shut out of end-to-end encryption. And, you know, earlier today, we heard another speaker talk about going dark, that James Comey, FBI director, about, I don't know, in the 2010, or I can't remember what year he said it. He said, we're going dark. And, you know, we're in the golden age of surveillance. The FBI and other law enforcement peers in other countries are enjoying a period of pervasive surveillance. You know, in the UK, there's tens of millions of cameras all over the UK with facial recognition algorithms behind those cameras. And so the level of surveillance that they have today is enormous. And so to say that we're going dark, it's kind of like, imagine a big flat panel display, you know, 4K display with a couple of missing pixels, dark pixels, and say, oh my goodness, we're going dark. No, there's just a couple of little pixels that they haven't been able to penetrate. And I would like to suggest that we fight for the right to keep those few remaining pixels that are still belong to us. You know, PGP started out as a human rights project. It was not a commercial product at the beginning. It was a human rights project because I wanted to make a tool that could be used to protect human rights workers in countries with autocratic governments that they were operating in a very dangerous, life-threatening environment, and they needed to have some way to secure their communications. And so PGP was that kind of a product. There was other encryption software at the time, but it was weak encryption. And that might have been good enough for commercial use because companies at that time were mainly concerned about their competitors. And they didn't worry too much about their competitors being able to decrypt their communications because their competitors did not have any significant cryptanalytic capabilities. So who cares if it was 56-bit DES? You know, that was good enough for companies to use. But PGP was not designed for that threat model. It was designed for a threat model where the presumed opponent is the intel agencies of the two superpowers and their client states. Their client states could rely on the superpowers to help them penetrate the communications of maybe their own citizens, you know, because they were autocratic regimes. And so PGP had to have strong encryption, and it had to do things in a way that it made it accessible to the average person to use. That means it can't be a top-down architecture with trust dictated from on high, you know. The prevailing wisdom at that time was that public keys could be signed by a certificate authority. And there was really only one certificate authority. That was from RSA Data Security, which later spun off another company called VeriSign. And so you were forced to trust VeriSign to sign your key. And they would collect fees because they had a patent on public key cryptography. So PGP made it possible to do this in a more decentralized way where anybody could sign anyone else's key. And keys would collect signatures from a lot of different people. And as long as one of those signatures was from someone that you trust, then you can assume that that key was legitimate, that the name on the key goes with the key. Because whoever signed it, let's say it was signed by 20 different people. Let's say you don't know who those 20 people are, but one of the people, you know who that is, and you trust them. And so you assume that the name goes with that key because somebody vouched for it, somebody that you know and trust. Now, somebody else might look at the same key with the same 20 signatures, and they would trust it for a different reason because they know someone else who was amongst the 20 signers. And so this was a decentralized grassroots trust model. And I felt that that was important for avoiding the centralized top-down trust model that was the prevailing wisdom at the time. You know, that Tears for Fears song, "Everybody Wants to Rule the World," you know. So everybody wanted to be at the top of that pyramid. But PGP allowed a more grassroots approach where, you know, they had groups of people, sometimes they would gather in PGP key signing parties. Now, if you ever want to see a lot of nerds in one room, that's a lot of nerds in one room. It still happens today, yes. And so that decentralized trust model I felt was more democratic, more immune to a single point of failure of somebody at the top being corrupt and signing a key that they shouldn't sign. For example, many years ago, there was a certificate authority in the Netherlands called DigiNotar. They were in the business of charging money for signing keys for websites, TLS keys. And an Iranian hacker broke into their servers and somehow got his hands on the top-level signing key. And he used that to forge certificates for lots and lots of websites. Gmail, Facebook, US government agencies, various social networks, and mail service providers. And then he used those forged credentials. He gave them to the Iranian government, who then used them to conduct man-in-the-middle attacks on all the Iranian dissidents who were communicating, you know, their ideas about freedom. They could then read the traffic and arrest those dissidents and put them in Iranian prisons. And so if you need an example of what's wrong with the centralized trust model, look no further than the absolute catastrophe of the DigiNotar case, where people were put in prison and presumably tortured, maybe sometimes killed, because of a single point of failure of somebody compromising the top-level signing key for a certificate authority. This is why PGP has a decentralized grassroots trust model, because you can decide for yourself who you trust to sign keys. And, you know, in a world where if they were using the PGP trust model, people could say, well, I no longer trust DigiNotar. And, you know, and then their signatures would be worthless. So the trust model is important, and so that was something that made PGP unique. That wasn't the only thing that we did to end the export controls. We also did something to make it easy to export strong cryptographic software source code by publishing the source code to PGP in a book. First, it was MIT Press in 1994, maybe it was 1995, where they published the source code to PGP, and that's because I was planning to use it at trial. If I was indicted and had to go through a trial, then I would point to the source code published by MIT Press and say, see, you know, you don't have export controls on books. This is the source code to PGP published in a book. How can you send me to prison for publishing something that is in a book? And And the reason why I thought, does that mean I only have 3 minutes left? It says 3 minutes and 10 seconds.
Take your time. Take your time. Just
Okay.
do what you do.
This is the last session?
Yep. Your last session. Good. You can talk as long as everybody wants to.
I got a couple of stories to tell.
Until the lights go out, it's fine.
Yeah. So I was at a Computers, Freedom, and Privacy conference in 1994. And I was approached by Bob Pryor, who was the editor-in-chief of the MIT Press, which is a prestigious academic press. I mean, they publish lots of computer science books. And he wanted me to let them publish the PGP user's manual. And I said, sure. But at that moment, I was still under criminal investigation by US Customs for exporting PGP. So I said, however, I'd like to publish 2 books. First, we'll publish the book you just asked for, the PGP User's Guide. That's fine, but I want another book. This book should contain all the source code to PGP. I want that published by MIT Press. And he said, well, that's a strange thing to ask for. Why do you want to do that? Well, the reason why I wanted to do that was because at the same time that was going on, an engineer who worked for Qualcomm in California, a guy named Phil Karn, was suing the government. Why? Because earlier, he went down to the bookstore and bought a copy of Bruce Schneier's book, Applied Cryptography. And in that book, there is some source code for the Federal Data Encryption Standard in an appendix to the book. And so he sent this book to the State Department and applied for permission to export the book. It was called a commodities jurisdiction. And he said, I'd like to export this book. And the State Department looked at it and said, why are you bothering us with a stupid question like this? Of course you can publish it. I mean, of course you can export this book. It's only a book. We don't have any rules against against exporting books. We're not in the business of preventing people from exporting books. So don't bother us with these questions. Of course you can have permission. Don't even ask us for permission, So they granted him permission to export this book, Bruce Schneier's Applied Cryptography. Now, I think at the time, Phil Karn didn't even know Bruce Schneier. He just went and bought a copy of Bruce Schneier's book from, well, it wasn't Amazon at the time. I think it was Borders Bookstore, And so what the State Department didn't know is that Phil Karn had laid a trap for them. Because as soon as Phil Karn got permission to export that book, he sent them a floppy disk and said, I'd like permission to export this floppy disk. And this floppy disk contains source code for the Federal Data Encryption Standard. And the State Department looked at it and said, well, obviously not. We're not going to give you permission to export this floppy disk. This is a floppy disk. You're exporting software. You can't do that. You can't export encryption software. We don't give you any permission for this. And Phil Karn said, wait a second. You just gave me permission to export this book. The source code in the appendix of this book is identical to the contents of this floppy disk. They are one and the same. He took what was in the appendix of the book, he put it on a floppy disk, and they were prohibiting him from exporting the floppy disk. And he said, you've got to give me permission to export this because you already said yes to the book. Well, they said no. They asked the NSA for advice, and NSA said, no, do not give him permission. So he had to appeal it through a couple of layers of administrative appeals, and they kept on saying no. So he sued them in federal court. So at the time that Bob Pryor approached me and asked me to, publish a book, and I said, well, let's publish 2 books, including all the source code to PGP, MIT Press did exactly that. And they applied for a commodities jurisdiction. That's what it's called, that thing that Phil Karn did. They filled out the same forms that Phil Karn filled out, asking permission to export the book from MIT Press containing all the PGP source code. It wasn't some small subroutine that did the data encryption standard. No, this was like 900 pages of source code Even the make files were in there. And so suddenly the State Department realized that they were in a real shitstorm of trouble, because they were defendants in civil litigation in federal court. Phil Karn had trapped them with this, and I was taking advantage of this trap along with MIT Press. And by the way, MIT Press did not wait for permission. They started exporting the book immediately to their overseas resellers. And so, the State Department never responded. They never gave him permission, and they didn't deny him permission. MIT Press, I mean, because they asked NSA what to do, and the NSA said, well, whatever you do, don't say yes. They didn't say to say no, because if they said no, then that would have been a big First Amendment case. So they just remained silent, and they never got back to MIT Press, which is too bad, because I was planning on using it at trial if I was indicted. In fact, I didn't really care whether they said yes or not. If they said no, then I was going to use that at trial, because it's obviously a First Amendment case. And if they said yes, well, then I was going to use that at trial, because that means that what I did wasn't so bad if they're going to let. They knew that if they said yes to MIT Press, the very next day they would get a floppy disk in the mail from MIT Press, just like they did with Phil Karn. Only this floppy disk would not be just one DES subroutine. It would be the entire source code of PGP version 2.6.2, which was already widely deployed around the world. And so, so that was part of my strategy to win at trial if I was indicted. Well, later on, the government dropped their case against me in early 1996. And so I started a company after that to commercialize PGP. And the first thing we did was we made a new version of PGP that was more advanced and had a GUI interface for Windows and whatnot. And it was 5,000 pages of source code. And we published it in a book. Only this time, we actually put some effort into making it scannable with OCR. Well, we had some friends in Europe that put a lot of effort into scanning it, and it turns out that it's not easy to scan C source code with OCR. You can do that with English or French or Spanish or any human language, because you can use spelling dictionaries to resolve ambiguities in the scan. But that doesn't work so well for C source code. So we found that it took like 1,000 man-hours for them to hand correct 5,000 pages of C source code. And we realized that we made a terrible mistake by underestimating the difficulty of doing OCR scans of thousands of pages of C source code. So we had 3 engineers, myself included, work hard on making some special tools that we got notes back from Europe about what kind of errors they saw when they were trying to scan it. And then we built tables out of those errors to try to understand the most frequently occurring errors that you'd get from OCR scanning of C source code. And we wrote some custom software that had a heuristic that would correct these errors. And we published that in a book also, in the same format as the rest of the book, of the next edition. And this book was called Tools for Publishing Source Code via OCR. And you could bootstrap the book, because the first page in the book was a Perl script that was smart enough to scan and fix the errors on the second page. And the second page was another Perl script, but much denser than the first page and more complexity. And then that was smart enough to fix the problems of the next 100 pages. There was 100 pages of C source code that had this really highly sophisticated heuristic that could scan in millions of lines of C source code and to automatically fix the errors based on the knowledge that we gained from the failure, well, not real failure, but the inadequate effort we had of publishing the first attempt. And so that fixed the errors so fast that it outran the sheet feeder on the page scanner. And so what took us 1,000 man-hours the first time we tried it without these tools, it took 30 man-hours. And after that, we were able to export arbitrary quantities of C source code without errors. And it was at that, and later I heard from people in the intelligence agencies that they realized that they had lost, that they were no longer able to stop the export of strong cryptography, because now we had tools for exporting arbitrary amounts of C source code, or any source code. And so that's part of our strategy for how we brought an end to the export controls. In 2000, they relaxed the export controls, and, you know, the crypto wars were over. I'd like to open it up for questions. I thought I would open it up for questions a bit earlier than this, but I got talking too much. Yeah?
Wait a second, let us get a microphone over there to...
Do you have any advice for folks, and I'm going to say the word dissidents rather than folks.
Wait, say that again, please.
Do you have any advice for folks of a dissident orientation operating today in terms of doing what they're doing and avoiding an orange jumpsuit? Like not going to jail? Because you've successfully done that. Like you fought your fight, you didn't end up behind bars. Advice for people looking to do the same in terms of winning strategies?
Well, it depends on what you're doing. You know, I tried to conduct my legal defense team in such a way that we would prevail. But I guess each struggle has its own limits that it's testing, and so I'd have to know something about each struggle to give advice on that. But I think what I did is that I tried to avoid the appearance of being a fist-shaking libertarian saying, let's stick it to the man. No, I was non-confrontational. I did what I had a good legal defense team, and I followed their advice, but I did insist on speaking in public about it. And most criminal defense lawyers will never let their client do that. But I was convinced that we had a better chance of winning if I could speak in public. So I did about 5 press interviews a week for 3 years. And the result was a good outcome. But I always wore a suit when I spoke in public because I wanted to appear to be a middle-class, responsible citizen who has a job and a mortgage and a family and responsibilities. And, that I'm not trying to be confrontational. I would never use the term sovereign citizen or, I wasn't trying to take an anarchy approach or a libertarian approach. I was trying to take a very, sort of conservative, respectable image that I was cultivating carefully, and that seemed to work pretty well. 100% of the press interviews were sympathetic to my cause and critical of the government's position. Not 99%, not 99.9%. I've done about 1,500 press interviews over the years. Every single one of them was sympathetic to my position. And I think that maybe that had some effect on their decision making. They decided at Main Justice not to proceed with the indictment. But it still took years later to get the export controls lifted. And right now, we're facing this again because of the governments of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the US, and the UK, all pushing back against end-to-end encryption. And so we have to push back against that. And, when I push back against it now, I don't take a confrontational position with them saying that they're stupid or misguided or something. I instead say, look, This is a matter of national security. We, you know, it used to be they said national security, you know, but no, I'm switching the tables now. I'm saying national security. Because today we find ourselves in an environment where China has deployed lots and lots of 5G infrastructure all over Europe. And I think that European countries are starting to realize that maybe this is a bad idea to buy all this 5G gear from Huawei. And so I think they're trying to pull back on that, but I don't know how long it's going to take for them to clean that up. But there's still a lot of 5G gear from Huawei, and that means that the entirety of society is dependent on this network infrastructure that's under the control of a potential adversary that we could be fighting a war against at some point.
So I'm an American.
And so, you know, this gives the Chinese an ability to do signals intelligence in Europe that's comparable to what the NSA can do. And, you know, you might say, well, it's morally equivalent. There's no difference morally between China and the NSA. Well, you know, I don't think the NSA is a sovereign state of itself. I think it's under the direction of whoever we elect into the White House. And that was the problem with, you know, George W. Bush directing the NSA to spy on Americans and spy on everybody and to violate, you know, enough laws that Edward Snowden decided to blow the whistle. But now I argue in favor of national security by saying that all the European countries that have deployed Huawei gear means that their banking, their national security apparatus, their tech companies, the whole of civil society is using a network under the control of a potential adversary. And that's a bad place to be. You know, I've been to Ukraine about a dozen times because I did some software development there. And when I first visited them about 15 years ago, I talked with some Ukrainian military guys about what would happen if Russia invaded. And they said, well, they would absolutely destroy us because, first of all our battlefield radios are made in Russia. How are we going to fight an enemy where they control the radios that we use to talk about how to defend ourselves? That's the same kind of situation we find ourselves in when we're using Chinese infrastructure for 5G. Well, the one countermeasure that we have against that, I mean, first of all, the best countermeasure is to dismantle all that and to buy European vendors' equipment. But I don't know how long that's going to take. But our best countermeasure right now is to use end-to-end encryption. If you're forced to use a communications network controlled by your adversary, you better be using end-to-end encryption. And so if law enforcement is arguing that, oh, we don't want end-to-end encryption because it makes our job too hard, well, I'd like to point out that it's better if the cops have to work a little harder to avoid being owned by the Chinese or the Russians, you know. We need to protect ourselves for national security reasons, and we need end-to-end encryption to do that. So, yeah, I think I took too long to answer that question. Thank you. All right.
Do we have another question?
Hi again. How do we fight back against the non-blackening of our screens? What suggestions would you have what suggestions would you have to keep those black pixels on that 4K TV you talked about earlier?
Well, part of it is to push back hard, and you could try to use the national security argument. Now, I don't know if the European countries have a divergence between the intel agencies and law enforcement, but in the US there was a divergence because part of the NSA's job was to protect American communications. There used to be part of the NSA called the Information Assurance Directorate. They're the ones that came out with, like, when they recommended everybody get ready for quantum computers. That came from IAD. And so their other job is to do signals intelligence. So these two parts of NSA are not always on the same page. But the NSA, the part of the NSA that's responsible for safeguarding American communication, I mean, they're the ones that they participated in the advanced encryption standard in the late 90s. That was before 9/11. That was before the NSA changed their behavior. But, you know, I don't know how the European intel agencies feel about this. But I think there should be a split in the approach taken by law enforcement versus the intel agencies. I think intel agencies should recognize the need for end-to-end encryption to protect the whole of society against foreign intelligence agencies. And right now, we're fighting a war in Ukraine. And by the way, you know, as much as the NSA was, you know, was creating a lot of problems for me back in the 90s, but when I see what's going on in Ukraine today, I'm glad the NSA is in there doing their job on the battlefield, you know, intercepting Russian communications. That's what we pay them to do. That's what intel agencies should be doing. And it's not just NSA, it's also other Western NATO allies, intel agencies are participating in that. So we haven't, you know, there's a legitimate need for intel agencies, especially if there's a war, like right now. But they were doing the wrong thing when George W. Bush directed them to spy on Americans and to do other things that people who worked at NSA found moral objection to, like Snowden. And he wasn't the only one. There was several, I think it was like half a dozen people before him were blowing the whistle. And I'd like to point out that during World War II, there were thousands of people working at Bletchley Park, breaking the German Enigma and reading the Japanese codes. None of them were blowing the whistle. And why not? Well, because the Luftwaffe was bombing London every night and bombing other parts of the UK. They had the moral certitude that what they were working on was morally important to do. And so, of course, there were no whistleblowers. And so if you don't want whistleblowers, you should have your intel agencies do things that people agree is moral. And that's not what the NSA was doing, morally questionable things, and that's why Snowden and other whistleblowers came forward. So maybe I took too long on that answer as well. Yeah.
Maybe ask it against, yes,
Yeah.
so we have it for the live stream.
Start over now that you have the microphone.
Sure. So just a simple kind of clarification question on what you just said, which, because you mentioned when it comes to end-to-end encryption, that you like to make the argument that it's a question of national security.
It's more than that, but I do use national security as one of the different arguments.
So the question was, you know, when it came to PGP, aside from presenting yourself as, you know, a respectable middle-class citizen, did you have a moral narrative that you projected that was so convincing that people, you know, aside from the kind of demographic and the non-threatening nature of your appearance, that they were willing to accept?
At that time in the early 90s, when it started to come down on me, I took the position of protecting human rights workers. It wasn't so much about protecting national security at that time. Today it is. But at that, I mean, you know, because of the context we have today, the deployment of 5G gear from China, you know. But in the early 90s, it was to protect human rights. It was to protect grassroots political organizations in the United States who were in opposition to the White House. I mean, when I first had the idea of doing this, it was in the 1980s. Reagan was in the White House. And it was accusing, I was a peace activist at the time. You know, I was working in the nuclear weapons freeze campaign, and Reagan's White House accused us of being Soviet puppets. Well, I knew for sure I was not a Soviet puppet, and none of my friends were either. And so, you know, I felt that grassroots political organizations in the United States needed to protect themselves from the White House and our, you know, that they were spying on us. And I also felt that human rights workers in other countries that were operating under far worse conditions than we were needed protection. And so PGP was, the motivation for PGP was that, and that was the moral argument that I was making at that time in that context. But, you know, now I feel like I can get more mileage out of trying to make the national security argument. But still, there's the, here's another thing, and this is maybe the most important reason of all. Look around you. We see democracies all over the world sliding into autocracies. You know, in 1994, I visited Europe for the first time, and I went to Bucharest, and I saw a horrible society. The 1994 version of Bucharest was pretty dismal. And the society had been ruined by years of Ceausescu's cruel regime. And then I went to Budapest on the same trip. And there I found a positive society where they were on the move to move toward the West, to look toward and optimistically toward democracy. That was where they wanted to go. And so, you know, I got a much more positive vibe from that. But fast forward to today, Hungary is not like it was in 1994. Instead, it has Viktor Orban running things. And he has seized control of the courts, of the press, of academia, of all kinds of elements of a democracy are now under his control. And, you know, and Hungary's not the only place. I mean, Poland also has moved in that direction. And Italy, you know, and Brazil, you know, I mean, fortunately they got rid of that guy. But, you know, it could happen again. And worst of all, imagine what would happen if it happened to the United States. The US would drop out of NATO. It could still happen. I find that terrifying. And so, if we lose democracies through free and fair elections, it happens. I mean, that's typically how these autocrats come to power. They don't do it by, you know, having gunfights in the street. They do it by getting elected, and then they seize control of the elements of a free democracy. If that happens, it's important that that new regime not have a legal environment that makes it illegal to use strong encryption. We need to have infrastructure around us, pervasive deployment of strong encryption, end-to-end encryption, because if we live in a society that in the future starts to collapse into autocracy, that we have the tools to oppose this and to try to win it back for democracy. And we need strong encryption end-to-end to do that. It's happening all over the world. Lots of democracies have either already collapsed into autocracies or are in danger of doing so. The largest democracy in the world, India, is under the rule of someone who has been trying to take more and more power. We need to have these tools to preserve our ability to resist autocracies. And strong encryption, end-to-end encryption, is part of that. And that is the most compelling argument that I think we have to try to insist that they not take away from us the few remaining pixels in our, yeah.
I think that's a great way to,
I guess I'm out of time, right?
to end that one. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us and your pronouncements for how it is that we should move forward. Mr. Phil Zimmermann, thank you so much.